Hello and thanks so much for tuning in. This is Spotlight on ET Now and I'm Alex Matthew. A lot's been said in the recent past about China's regulatory policies. In fact, one commentator that I spoke to said that China in this sense is like Facebook. It is moving fast and breaking things from a regulatory perspective. There are several issues that the country is currently facing with regard to real estate, power, steel production, and not to mention the big crackdown earlier in the year on big tech. There's also growing buzz around the world on what's been called China Plus One. It's a strategy where global producers look beyond China to set up manufacturing bases. Can India benefit from that? Let's start, as we always do, with the context. China has made headlines through most of this year for dramatic changes in regulation and policy in multiple sectors, right from big tech and education technology to real estate and the production of power and steel. Perhaps the most notable crackdown with the most eye-popping results was on Chinese big tech. It began with a crackdown on Jack Ma and consequently on Alibaba and the Ant Group. Ma went missing after he criticized China's regulators for stifling innovation. Then the Ant Group's double IPO in Shanghai and Hong Kong was abruptly put on ice. But it didn't stop there. Just days after its IPO in the US, Chinese regulators ordered a security review of Didi Chuxing and then demanded that the company's apps be removed from the mobile stores. Then, in a separate development, China launched a crackdown on its online education companies, which it said had been hijacked by capital. It announced that a large number of these companies would not be allowed to make profits and would be restricted from raising capital overseas. The regulators also stepped in to say that food delivery companies like Meituan would have to ensure that workers made at least the local minimum income. Besides those, the Chinese government has moved to regulate cryptocurrencies and even the number of hours that children can spend on video games. These crackdowns, according to experts, are a bid by Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to exert more control. And one of those areas is real estate.
All that we can see is that China seems to have decided that it's being forced, partly by its own choice, but partly by the response of the American administration, to adopt a much tougher, much more government-led and much more self-reliant approach to industrial policy. So it really seems to have decided that the old model that it was following, where in addition to, of course, all this enormous government support, you also had a very loose attitude toward private firms because it was understood that they were the ones who had made tremendous technological breakthroughs. And that's changing now. The government has clearly indicated that it wants direct control over several key areas.
China watchers have for years warned of a bubble in its property market. And in many key markets, property prices are beyond the reach of the average Chinese citizen. Recent measures mark a shift in the approach to the sector. China has raised mortgage rates in a major city and promised to accelerate the development of government-subsidized rental housing. It has also increased oversight on everything from financing of developers and newly listed home prices to title transfers. And debt, in fact, is what has been the Achilles heel of the Evergrande Real Estate Group. Once a poster child of China's rapid growth and development, now on the brink of collapse. Here, a number of factors are playing out simultaneously. The company already has a mountain of debt at over $300 billion, and tighter norms on financing have made it harder to raise more. In the past, Evergrande has offered its properties at discounted levels to keep servicing debt, but there are few takers now, with buyers sensing an imminent price correction in China's inflated property market. The company is currently scrambling to raise funds to pay lenders, suppliers, and investors. But Chinese authorities have reportedly asked local governments to prepare for the company's potential downfall. But while several of the Chinese government's policies relate to issues of inequality, some have to do with its long-term goals on emissions. China aims to be carbon neutral by 2060. And the steel sector is one of the biggest polluters in the country, accounting for between 10 and 20% of carbon emissions. According to reports, restrictive output measures for steel are already showing signs of taking effect. Steel production declined in early September, having fallen to a 17-month low in August. The power sector too is bearing the brunt of China's emission goals. The government's attempt to cap energy consumption have made a sensitive situation much worse. As much as 56% of China's power production depends on coal. The sector was already contending with coal shortages and soaring fuel prices. But now, according to the South China Morning Post, coal used to generate electricity held by the country's 6 biggest generation companies stood at a record low of 11.31 million tons as on the 21st of September. That's just enough to produce power for 15 days. The clamour is growing for higher coal imports, and that will likely result in higher costs for manufacturers, many of whom are already working on a backlog of orders. And all of this is likely to impact growth in the world's second largest economy. Economists at Goldman Sachs, for example, have lowered their forecast for China's economic growth in 2021 to 7.8% from 8.2% earlier, and that's expected to moderate further to 5.5% in 2022. And what's more, other countries sensing opportunity are now rolling out the red carpet to global manufacturers. And India is one of those countries. In Mumbai, for ET Now, this is Alex Matthew. Alright, now there are experts right off the bat that believe that there are some immediate benefits that can be gained by India and its companies. Listen in to Peter Maguire.
Well, there is no doubt that from an environmental perspective, that China has taken a step forward as far as their realization that the 40 years of burning fossil fuels, of their addiction to energy and electricity and coal-fired power plants and so on, they're cleaning up their act, or their focus is, and that's going to have impact. And as we understand from even the production side as far as steel, there are going to be other players in the market that are going to fill the breach. So from a supply line or supply shocks that can enter a market, from manufacturing, I think other nations across the Asia region, and India will play very handsomely from a steel production side. So I think their time to shine is going to be very much this decade, and the demand picture for steel, I think, is going to be immense over the next 10 to 15 years with the rebuilding of many nations due to massive infrastructure spends from government.
But others believe that it's not going to be as easy as snapping your fingers. Swaminathan Iyer, for one, believes that India has quite a few challenges that it needs to overcome, and that it will likely never become an export-oriented powerhouse like China. Listen in.
India can try. India has a problem that because of its different political constraints, it is not a low-wage country. It is not a cheap infrastructure country. It is not a country with cheap land. If you ask around, if people are to come here, what is the advantage of India? The biggest advantage, I would say, is the size of your domestic market. And because the size of the domestic market is there, once somebody comes and sets up a large-scale manufacturing, at marginal cost, you can export also. So this was originally China's advantage. It is also India's advantage. But as I said, India has its own disadvantages. In real terms, for instance, all those garments and other things, everything gone to Bangladesh. It is not coming to India, and it will not come to India. The cheap electronics, some of that may come, because on the mobile side and on the component side, the Indian market is so large that when the people come in, taking advantage now of the PLI scheme, yes, you will produce for the Indian market, and the small surplus over and above that, at marginal cost, you will be able to export. So this is the kind of money that will come into India. India is not going to become an export-oriented powerhouse the way China is, or the way Vietnam is right now. In fact, the real problem with India has been that until this year, exports were more or less stagnant since 2013. This was your biggest problem. I mean, forget about competing with any, becoming a world power. I mean, Bangladesh was over 90% GDP. If you do not have dynamic, strong exports, double-digit growth, you cannot sustain 7% GDP growth and you cannot be a miracle economy. So the stagnation of exports from 2013 onwards foretold that, this is not sustainable. If you can't do something about this, your GDP will fall. And the GDP began to fall. It went from 8% to 7, 6, and 4 just before COVID. It's got reversed now. This year, exports at last are growing in double digits. And with that, there is some hope of GDP coming up. So I said, unless India can get its act together and say, look, we are a relatively high-cost nation on several parameters, on land, on interest rate, on our logistics, even the real cost of labor. And we need to do something to reduce the cost of all these and become competitive. I think the RBI has done its bit by saying that earlier on the rupee was appreciating. Now the RBI has come in to stop the rupee from appreciating, and in the bargain, the foreign exchange reserves have more or less doubled. So, I mean, that action has been taken. So these are the things India has to do to attract. Now, the sums that we are getting are reasonable, but let's not kid ourselves that we are going to be saved by foreign investment. I mean, if you get foreign investment of 60 billion, I mean, that's fine, but your domestic investment will be 10, a huge, so many, almost 10, more than 10 times as much as that. So ultimately, the bulk of our investment is going to be domestic. There will be a useful contribution by foreign investment, which will include links to foreign technology and foreign markets. So it's an important part of total investment. But FDI will always be a very small part of total investment. Ultimately, there is a lot we have to do by ourselves in the sense of making ourselves cost competitive and in terms of investment itself. That is what will give you growth. Xi Jinping is posing this question of where does China go from now? On the economic side, he sees the need to get away from the current trend where there has been too much concentration of wealth in a few hands, too much chasing after money, and too much ignoring the social aspects, which the Communist Party of China should be stressing. And I think he's trying to assert himself over the party that, we have gone too far down the issue of Deng Xiaoping's thing of to be rich is glorious. Okay, you need to be rich, you also need to look after other things. But it's more than that. I think there is a very clear feeling of unease that the Chinese Communist Party will lose control if you have a very large number of ultra-rich guys like Jack Ma who come up and become a force on their own, which will therefore pose a threat in political terms and in financial terms, even in the realm of ideas. And they don't want to lose this particular ground. They want to reassert themselves in this ground. So very clearly, this is a combination of the two. So on the one hand, there is a crackdown on people who are prominent and open their mouths, like Jack Ma. I think a clear message is, if you want to be rich, it's possible. But first, you must make noises about how you're sharing your prosperity. Secondly, you should shut up in trying to give lectures to the Communist Party on how to run things and how to go into the future. Especially Jack Ma complained that the Communist Party seems to have a pawnbroker mentality and doesn't know how to handle fintech, the new ways of getting directly loans out to small people without collateral. And I think there are a number of dangers in Jack Ma's approach. So I think, in economic terms, many people will say that China was in some ways a highly unregulated economy in some critical sectors, and a tightening of those regulations would have been required in any Western country in similar circumstances. So that is non-ideological, and that is a technocratic thing which needed to be done anyway. And that would be there over and above, as I said, these particular political issues. So on the economic side, I think those are the issues. On the political side, of course, they are having to deal with a new with a new Biden administration, which says that, we want to have some kind of conclave of democracies to strengthen their position and maybe take up some position against China. But this is not a Cold War II. Definitely not a Cold War II. In Cold War I, Russia had a separate economic system. It has the Comecon system, the ruble area. They did not seek to be members of the World Bank, IMF. They did not focus on international trade. They focused on internal trade, on self-sufficiency within Comecon. China is very clearly an important part of the world economy, something that Xi Jinping acknowledges and Biden acknowledges. So it's not the old Cold War like against the USSR. But they have, while they have an important trade and investment relationship, political things are going to put a number of limits on the extent of cooperation. In the past, it was any kind of foreign trade and foreign investment was welcome. Now political issues will come in, strategic issues will come in. There will be some limitations, but yet I'm quite sure that a globalized economy will continue. China and America and the rest of the world will continue mutual trade and mutual investment. To that extent, it will not be like Cold War I.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about the China Plus One strategy and where India stands in the larger scheme of things. My guest today is Anjani Kumar, who is partner at Deloitte. Anjani, thank you so much for taking the time. You've studied this in some detail. You've spoken with companies from around the world. You've got insight into what these business leaders are thinking. So my first question to you is, can it be said that India currently stands at the front of the line of countries that could benefit from China Plus One?
So thanks for inviting me to the show, Alex, and a very good evening to you and viewers. Let me take that question in two parts. One is the size of the opportunity per se, and where does India stack up with respect to capitalizing on the opportunity. I think the opportunity per se is fairly large. When we've done an analysis and looked at about $2.5 trillion worth of exports of China, and what part of it can India actually have a meaningful role in, we looked at multiple sectors which contribute to this 2.5 trillion exports of China. And we found out that there are about 8 to 10 sectors where India has at least a 1 to 2% say already in the global trade or global exports. And hence, there is a meaningful play for India in those sectors. And when I add up those sectors, it's about a 1.7 trillion opportunity, or it's a play for India. Coming to the second question, how realistic is it? And if you ask me, is India the first country that organizations look at when companies are thinking of China Plus One strategy? The answer clearly is no. They are looking at, India is definitely in the consideration set, but it's not yet in the forefront and not necessarily the first country that organizations look at when they're thinking of China Plus One.
So in a sense, it's been said, Anjani, and in conversations that ET Now has had not too long back also, is that there are issues in terms of the relatively high cost of labor, land, logistics. Is that the reason why India is down the pecking order?
So, Alex, I think those are important contributing reasons for sure. But recently, when we've spoken to about 1,200 executives of MNCs across 4 countries, which are the largest contributors of FDI to India, while those reasons came across as important, I think what was the single largest prohibitor of making investments is the lack of what they said institutional stability. So that translated in terms of clarity in regulatory reforms, tax regulation, judicial redressal mechanisms. So that came across as a more important aspect, which is preventing some of these companies from investing in India. I think the other important aspect that came across as a result of this conversation is there is a fairly sharp divide across countries. So when we spoke to executives in US and UK, the propensity to invest was far higher than some of the Asian countries like Japan and Singapore. So there's almost a divide in that sense. And I think one of the things that we as business stakeholders will have to do is go out there and share some of the changes that the government has done, some of the reforms that have been brought in, to make sure that these are well understood by investors, which I believe has a direct correlation to increasing their propensity to invest in India.
Okay, you mentioned about 8 sectors that can benefit significantly. Could you talk about some of the key measures that have been taken in the recent past and that could be communicated, that could see immediate movement on the ground, Anjani?
Absolutely. In fact, what we did was, as part of our discussions with the MNC executives, we actually ran them through some of these changes and some of these reforms that the government has initiated. And the moment they understood more about these reforms, their willingness to invest increased significantly. And some of these changes are things like digitization of customs clearances, the PLI schemes, the easing of regulations in FDI across sectors, the Atmanirbhar scheme, the Made in India scheme, the bankruptcy laws that the Indian government has enacted, the reduction in taxation for some of the MNCs, the investments in infrastructure that the government has done. So if you look at some of these reforms and some of the schemes that are being rolled out by the government, when communicated and discussed with the executives, clearly had a positive correlation with their willingness to invest in India.
Okay. So definitely that's something that could pan out over the next few years at least, one would think. But I'm just trying to get a sense from you, these sectors that you've mentioned, I want to understand which they are. So I would think that chemicals would come in, pharmaceutical would definitely come in. So what would those sectors, key sectors be to watch?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that we looked at is, if you look at almost do a sector by sector analysis and look at sectors where India today has anywhere between 2 to 3% or higher share of global trade. And you're right, pharmaceuticals is one, chemicals and API is another, textiles is the third, food processing is a fourth. If you look at some of these sectors, clearly there is a distinction in the ability of India to attract significantly higher capital in these sectors because, one, they're province sectors. Secondly, there is an ecosystem that is existent in India. And thirdly, the government has been rolling out schemes, whether it's around SEZs, whether it's PLI schemes, focused on these sectors, which allow for these sectors to almost become a magnet for attracting significant amount of investments, which are not just for satiating the domestic demand, but also for organizations to use India as an export hub for these sectors. So I think, to my mind, it's almost a sector play, and the other variable is a country play. As I said, some countries, we've clearly had longer-term relationships. They've been investing in India for much longer. So as we look at an interplay of sector and countries, clearly looking at specific opportunities, specific organizations, getting them into India as anchor investors, and then growing the sector and making that sector an export hub for India is clearly what is eminently possible over the next few years.
All right, and certainly I'm going to end this conversation on that note, because that's certainly something to build towards, Anjani, something to hope for, and that's a positive note to end the program on. It's been an absolute pleasure to speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Alex.
On that note, that brings us to the end of this edition of Spotlight. Thank you so much for watching. This is ET Now.